Is Europe still overbanked?
Well, in some countries, I think it's a bit difficult to answer the question in Europe as a whole. So it depends on which country you look at. I mean, if you look at Germany, of course, what you notice is that the Sparkassen and the Landesbanken occupy a large piece of the market, and the amount of commercial banking in Germany is relatively small, which is why concentration is more difficult. Whereas if you look at Italy, you do see a tail of smaller commercial banks. Some of them, of course, used to be owned by foundations. So I would say that there's more scope for consolidation in Italy than there is in Germany.
How busy are you at RBS?
We're pretty busy. I mean, the mortgage market is okay. It's not racing ahead, but it's okay. Unsecured consumer lending is rising at about 8% a year. Corporate lending, we are seeing a bit of a hesitation on investment now, which may or may not be Brexit related, but we are seeing a bit of a pause in our pipeline. Hardly showed through in our reported figures, but the pipeline, looks a bit weaker than it did 6 months ago.
Sir Howard, if I look at EU banking, and for that matter, any banking, and I don't need to mention individual banks, when bodies walk out the door, whether it's the senior management, the people that speak to you, whether it's traders, whether it's the intellectual content or research, when those bodies walk out the door, how does the bank keep going?
Well, I mean, I guess you're saying if everybody walks out, they don't keep going. But the market is, for staff, is quite lively in London at present. But I'm not saying that we find it impossible to recruit people. We don't. I think the bank is now seen to be in a much better state than it was before, and people are attracted to come to work for us. I don't see overall a big problem, and as you've seen, more recent figures suggest that the banking still remains attractive to graduates, perhaps surprisingly so, you might say, but nonetheless, I think at the moment we find we're able to staff ourselves, even though unemployment's very low.
Within the intellectual content, you have to pay up. Discuss how you're going to have a salary bonus mix within all the pressures on compensation within the United Kingdom. How are you going to pay quantitative finance PhDs and retain those people, given the question about underpayment of women versus men?
Well, that is the last point is particularly difficult in the investment banking area, and it is notable at universities that the proportion of economics graduates and financial mathematics graduates who are women is relatively small. So it's not totally, it's not very small, but it's relative to other subjects. It's a bit smaller. So there is a problem in terms of the nature of the fish in the pool, and that's something that banks find it quite difficult to correct for, and why in investment banking you still see a rather unattractive gender balance. Now, I think all investment banks are trying their best to do something about that, trying to make their jobs more friendly, family friendly, because they're not especially. People are assumed to work very, very long hours, and it's not a very attractive place for women to work often. So it's a struggle. I don't think there's a single answer to it, but it's something that is very much top of mind in most financial institutions at the moment.
Regulators are increasingly concerned about cyber threats. How robust is the UK banking system to deal with cyber threats?
Yeah, well, I think the problem with it is that if you say, how robust are we at dealing with, as it were, rational threats, people who are trying to get at money, then I think that we actually are not bad at that. Now, one hesitates to say this because I just could walk back to the office today and find out there's been some problem. But I think that that is not so difficult to deal with. The more difficult thing is the pure disruptive threat, and the people who simply want to do a distributed denial of service or DDoS attacks that don't have an obvious motivation. And that, like any motiveless crime, that's the crime that police find the most difficult to deal with. Just the sort of random attack, which has no motive to it. So I would distinguish between the two. And I think that banks have shown that they're fairly robust to cyber threats, targeting actual diversion of funds. But you're never complacent about it because the nature of the threat's changing all the time.
I mean, if you talk about the second threat that you were mentioning, do banks work together, like even cross-Atlantic, to try and find a system, or is it, each to their own?
Well, it is a competitive environment, and there are a lot of fintech companies who are developing very interesting ideas. Where there is cooperation is through the various security agencies. So I think we have good cooperation in the UK. I would say that with the main security agencies, GCHQ and others here, that is pretty good. And there's a lot of good information sharing about emerging threats. And I would say I would be pretty positive about the way the government agencies work with us. But clearly, how you respond to those threats, there is a competitive dimension, and I don't think we would all... Well, there's also, of course, it would be quite dangerous if the banks all had the same defence mechanisms. Then the whole system would be vulnerable.